Hello, welcome everybody to this month's rendition of hashtag wdaychats. Thank you for joining us. Please join us in the comments and follow us on Twitter using hashtag wdaychats. I'd like to welcome our guests today, so why don't you gentlemen go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Rob Hull. I'm the founder at Adaptive Insights, a Workday company. Background as a CFO, and that was what led me to start Adaptive, just to try to solve my own problem, helping teams better manage their businesses. It's great to be here today.
Yeah.
Thanks. And my name is Bob Woods. I'm a partner with PwC. I specialize in modernizing finance functions and work with CFOs and their business partners to do so. And specifically, I work in the technology, media, and telecom sectors.
Excellent. Well, thank you for joining us. So let's start here. There's a lot of talk out there about modernizing the Office of Finance. At a high level, what are some of the trends that you guys are seeing regarding modernizing that office, just in general?
Sure. So one of the things that we're seeing is that there are a lot of questions that CFOs are trying to answer, and some are starting to converge in a list of topics that we're seeing common across industries. The two that I'd like to talk about today are really what success looks like and then what levers they're pulling. The success piece is one where there's a lot of confusion. People are trying to do efficiency-seeking outcomes while bringing a lever that is a modernizing lever. So the classic example is we're going to do a bot technology and we're going to try to take cost out, but a lot of times the way that that's deployed don't match up. So on the success, we're seeing 4 trends. One is efficiency-seeking, that I mentioned earlier, modernizing your finance function. And the other 2 that are emerging are around redefining your business model and then actually exploring new industries that you go into. So you think about the classic software company moving into hardware, or you think about a company that's bringing a services model to its existing brick and mortar, a lot of different changes there. The other on the levers that we're seeing is there's a lot of ways to change your finance function, but there's 7 that we're seeing converge, 2 around people, 2 around process, and 2 around what we call performance, which is really around analytics. The 2 around people are workforce in your workplace, so who's there, how are they working, process around automation, looking at risk and regulatory in a different way, and then the platforms you're using to drive that. And then finally, we're looking at a connected data environment for people, so providing self-service access through like an adaptive platform, as well as the enterprise performance motion that many companies use today.
Great.
Yeah, I guess I'll take it a little bit from a planning perspective, from the finance team's planning view. And if you look back over, we've been doing this for about 16 years. The first was sort of this move into cloud and sort of taking technology out of the sort of the old process and into a cloud process, which has really helped enable a better collaborative environment, particularly for planning. We also see just this continued expansion of the amount of data that's available.
Yep.
You talk about trying to connect it. There's a lot that's coming, and then the question is, now what do we do with it? How do we really begin to get some insights out of that data? So, working with that data has become a big trend, and that's then driving, I think, to now some of what's happening lately, which is how do we harness things like machine learning to try to better enable the use of that data behind the scenes to really enable a number of different efficiency and improvement gains across the organization.
It is interesting, too, that conversations have shifted from should we go to the cloud to how do I assemble the cloud offerings that are out there, the platforms, the applications, and the out-of-box solutions. And a lot of that is coming down to finance leaders saying this is what our platform is going to look like, and it's a multi-tenant, multi-application environment.
Yeah, I think if you look back years here, finance teams were a bit hesitant at first, right?
For sure.
The front office was automating in a way that really embraced the cloud.
Yep.
I think finance teams have gotten more comfortable, and to such a degree that now what we find is really finance teams going out and seeking out cloud-based applications as opposed to asking a question of, can I trust that, or why would I do that? Now it's really all about the realization that when I move to cloud, I'm empowered as a business owner, not quite as beholden to the IT organization. I'm in a little bit more control of my application and environment and space, and I'd say sort of the intuitive nature of the interfaces that are being built in cloud applications has really become a big aspect of why that begins to be so much more important for the finance team.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because a lot of these applications, your finance team can actually own the instance and run it themselves with minimal interaction with IT, as you mentioned.
Right.
So,
There's always a role. There's a role there for IT. Let's not get that wrong.
All right, so it was a good segue from Bob there, but let's talk a little bit about putting some of this change in the context of three buckets that you mentioned: process, people, and analytics. And let's start with the key process modernizations that we're seeing.
So on the process side, I split up thinking about there's transactional-based processes, there's sort of specialty areas, and then compliance. And on the specialty side, we're seeing, you mentioned machine learning, we're seeing a lot of application of how do we actually take the emotion out of our people from compiling data as well as interpreting it and putting it back into their hands to start analyzing it in a different way. And so taking 12 people that used to do a bunch of reading of orders or contracts, using scanning technology, natural language processing to put it back into their hands and redeploy those 12 people. And the interesting thing is that a lot of the CFOs I'm working with are saying, I hire smart people, I just want them to do smart work. Right. And that mindset offsets the conversation around, is this just a cost play? Are we trying to reduce the organization? What we're seeing is that many of the CFOs are trying to say, no, I have the right organization, I don't have them doing the right things yet, and they're allowing that. So on the specialty side, tax, treasury, FP&A, we're seeing machine learning. On the shared services side, transaction side, a lot of volume plays around whether you're using an outsourcer that's using bots, or you're seeing the application of NLP and OCR, like I mentioned earlier, into some of those processes. The interesting thing is that when you think about automation, analytics is a form of automation, and so those two things we're seeing come together where AI as this concept is starting to emerge, and what we're finding is many of the CFOs are asking now, what do I do with AI? And saying, well, that's just the convergence of your automation analytics journeys. So right. It's an interesting concept to take this big idea and start to move it to practical spaces, and we're seeing that across that spectrum of different processes, for sure.
Yeah, I think you're talking about some of the more advanced aspects of it. Maybe take a step back as well when I think about processes, because what we still see is that there are so many finance teams still based in Excel. As
100%.
That's the platform of choice for much of what they're doing.
Right.
And interestingly, it's not necessarily by choice. It's just sort of become the de facto place that people turn to.
Yeah.
Some of that transition that's happening, some of the modernization that's happening, is the realization that, in fact, Excel isn't actually the right place for a lot of the work that's being done. It's a great desktop productivity tool. Right. It can be a miserable collaborative business environment for particularly for larger teams. And so we're seeing in the planning world this sort of move from what we call static planning, which is sort of very episodic, and it's very not very efficient. It can be very error prone. And in many cases not as collaborative as you'd like it to be, to a much more, we call an active planning process, right? Much more collaborative across the organization, much more comprehensive in the modeling that's done, so not just about the finance models, but about the operational models that support those and the key drivers that those entail. And as a result of efficiency gains from the technology, really a much more continuous process as well. So rather than just doing an annual Excel-based plan that is incredibly painful, that no one really has confidence in, that is not very empowering, we're seeing a process that now moves to being much more rapidly pulled together in a very collaborative way that allows for almost an ongoing view of where are we headed. And so that process then of really planning, then executing, and then analyzing the results so that I can update plans can actually begin to happen more efficiently. So planning is definitely moving into a much more efficient world than we're seeing in the past. I think the other thing that we're seeing from a process perspective is really better automation of some of the reporting that finance is responsible for. And so trying to take some of the time both out of what the finance team does and give them that time back to be in a more value-added role, but also to try to empower managers outside of the finance organization with reporting that's a little bit more self-service, with access to data, that really, again, it emboldens them to be better owners and to be more empowered in the decisions that they're making. So those changes are definitely happening across the finance team today.
Yeah, and I do think, to your point, the collaboration piece is one of the things that's creating that stickiness now, because the idea that I have my set of Excel sheets or others, you can find ways to stitch that together, and many people are going down that path as well. But to your point, there's an employee experience aspect. There's also this idea of what we call enterprise and citizen-led, which is, are we as the finance leadership team going to determine what needs to be automated, or are we going to put some tools in our people's hands that show us what actually can be? And
Right.
so we're seeing that pivot to that view too, that it's an admitting that as finance leaders, our people know our business best, maybe we don't, and so how do we put some of those great tools in their hands
Right.
and allow that desktop productivity in a way that the spreadsheet did 20 years ago?
Right.
So it's a
Right.
different paradigm. Yeah.
I think that what that ultimately results in as well is you start to create a better single source of truth for information, for the data itself.
For sure.
And I think we're seeing, we talk to customers who will say, look, we used to get into a conference room and for the first 10 minutes, we'd argue over who had the right information, right? Which
Right.
data's right, what
Yep.
was the right answer, and by really transforming some of how data is both gathered and then shared, we can create a single source of truth. No one's arguing about what the right information is, and we're actually elevating the conversation to what do we do about this? What has this told us, and how do we now best optimize results as a result of the information that we have?
Yeah.
So.
Yep.
You touched on it a little bit. There's obviously a huge people component here, right? And I think about myself as a practitioner. The first is it requires a little bit of a leap of faith, right? To say, I'm going to give up absolute control of the spreadsheet offline environment, right? And then once you improve the process, you realize, wow, this is amazing, right? I think you touched on another aspect, which is by automating some of this, pushing some of the sort of ownership out throughout the organization, it frees up your finance team to do more strategic work, and you hear that all the time.
Right.
CFOs are saying, you know what, I'm no longer just the CFO. I'm sort of COO, CFO, and everything in between, right? So let's dive in a little bit more on how these modernizing impacts are affecting the people in the finance org.
Yeah, I think there's a couple different pieces. I think there is a fear factor for sure. I think a lot of people are wondering, is my job safe? You read a lot of different press around different topics. I would say consciously finance leaders understand that there is a growing demand for their service internally and externally, and there's not a fixed cost, but it is not an area that historically there's a lot of deferred maintenance and investment that needs to happen. And so what they're finding is that the people are actually the best lever they have instead of trying to just re-engineer process or data. And so they're starting with people and putting those tools in their hands to help them do that. Right. And so the first is really culture. We talked about this before this session around setting the right tone at the top that says this is a journey we're going to go on together, because a lot of times people just view it as a cost reduction journey, and that's not the case. The other is actually actively upskilling your people. And so one area we're clearly seeing is digital upskilling. We as ourselves as PwC have been investing heavily in that. I think the key thing is what upskilling means beyond just digital. And so one of the areas we're seeing is that business acumen area. To your point about being the COO, the CHRO, a lot of times it's what do we need to know as the business leader for that? And we're starting to see investment both on campus by CFOs to bring in some new talent from different parts of campus, as well as with their own team investing in upskilling of a different kind around business development, business model understanding, data architectures, different aspects they're going to need for the future. And so that's really where it's starting to land. The best leaders are the ones investing rather than trying to turn over their workforce to find someone new.
Yeah, I think, from a impact to the finance team in particular of modernizing some of how planning and reporting and analytics are happening, it's really about up-leveling the role that finance team plays. Absolutely. To be less reactive, sort of very tactical, and more forward-looking, much more strategic. And not just in helping to set strategy, but then helping to actually execute on that strategy. Looking to the CFO and the Office of Finance as really sitting at that intersection of strategy and execution across the organization, right? Access to all of the teams, access to data everywhere, an understanding really of the business itself and the business modeling. Yep. And so how, as a CFO, how do I take my finance team and actually get them more proactively engaging with managers around the organization and less just reacting to data requests and problems with spreadsheets and kind of consolidating data. So I think that with this modernization of planning in particular, what we're seeing is just more time taken or more time back into the hands of the finance team to really become those true business partners
Yeah.
to managers around the organization.
Right.
And as a result of that, you're seeing then for those business managers around the organization, again, this sense of empowerment. The data's better.
Yep.
The information that they're then asked to input and to contribute to the process are things that are more controllable by them, that they have a direct impact on, and so there's a better ownership, better empowerment of those managers around the organization. But it comes at a bit of a cost.
For sure.
And I think the cost is what you talked about as well, right? You've got to have finance team members that truly understand business models and,
Yep.
and understand their organization's
Yep.
key drivers and can help work with managers
Yep.
to pinpoint what those are and then to monitor and project what that's going to come out like in the future. I think that then says, all right, as a finance team, we've got to be really good at communication as well.
Right.
So gone are the days where I'd get a request, I'd sit down in my cube, I'd bang through some things, and then I'd spit back out some reports. Like
Yeah.
now I'm actually sitting down, I'm engaging, I'm trying to understand where managers are having trouble, what are they seeing, and helping them to maybe spot trends that they're not seeing, to understand where they might have some control and some levers that they might not have seen before.
Yeah.
That then moves them into a third requirement, which is that finance team has to be really comfortable with data,
That's
with
right.
analytics,
That's right.
and with modeling. And so in many cases, that's a skills training
That's right.
issue. In other cases, it might be adding new resources
New
to
resource.
your team.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's also creating a knock-on effect to organizational structures where we're seeing centers of excellence set up where it's not just finance offshoring or putting certain finance people in, it's taking the entire business and putting them in that center of excellence, or the inverse of it where they're taking finance people and putting them in tiger teams with the planning team, the marketing team, the product team, and they're all an active organization that acts separate from the mainline finance hierarchy. Both of those are some that we're seeing in different ways they're playing out in the market. But to your point, it requires the right skills and the right people, and it's pushing the boundaries of what is a finance organizational structure, and then what does it mean to collaborate? Because you mentioned communicate, collaborate.
Right.
It's not take data, push out. It's I got to understand your business in a totally different way.
Right.
And it's definitely changing the model.
Well, and we talked a little bit earlier about the control versus distribute
Yeah.
and empower mode, and so as a finance organization, do I try to control reporting, planning, analytics, or do I push that out, empower, provide some self-service, really engage managers?
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing certainly a little bit more of a trend towards some empowerment and
For sure.
a more distributed planning, reporting, analytics process over time.
Yeah.
But I think you mentioned this earlier. It requires sort of a culture shift, and sometimes, or
Yep.
a trust in the organization.
Yep.
I know you had some thoughts on that, right, Bob, in terms of
Yep.
driving it down from the top in terms of culture.
Yeah, it does start with clear messaging, having a CFO and a finance leadership team that actually understand and is on the same page about how they're going to go do and execute against their transformation objectives, and actually throwing out the word transformation, right? Because that requires that there's a journey and an end. What really there isn't, right? Because to your point about business models, every single business is being challenged to shift in terms of how they're delivering products and services to customers, who are their customers, and then what is it that they're actually trying to serve behind that in terms of a customer experience. And you mentioned earlier that the front office moving ahead of the back office, and I think what's really driving this is the fact that that customer experience is so tied together where when you press a button on a website or an app, or even when you make a phone call to someone that could be a bot talking to you, it's a totally different experience than it used to be before. And so that is driving that level of trust that says we're in this together, we need to change the way we're working. And it really starts with the CFO, not just messaging it, but also living it and starting to do that kind of work themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
You mentioned the word journey, and
Yep.
and I think it's important to also talk about the fact that whatever transformation people are going through, modernization that people are going through, I think that oftentimes people think of it as that there's some end goal that I'm going to get
Right.
to, and then I'm going to be done.
Yeah.
I can just say I don't think that's the right way to think about it.
Yeah.
That really, for a finance team, you're never done, right? Your business
Yeah.
is always changing, your competition is always changing, and as a result, the way that you think about planning, the way that you think about reporting and analytics should always be evolving. And so it truly
Yeah.
is a journey, and it's okay that there's always something more to be done. That you're going to be revisiting things, you're going to be reevaluating how you're
Right.
modeling your business, how you're running reports and the analytics that you're putting together. Those things should continue to evolve over time.
Yep.
And so hopefully we can leave people with the sense that you're never quite done, and that's
That's
a
right.
good thing. That's
That's right.
actually
Right.
okay.
Right.
Yeah. Yep.
You know, the other thing that you talked about was just sort of that broader organizational impact, and I think one of the other things that we're seeing is organizations really beginning to look much more strategically at how they plan for their
Right.
workforce of the future, how they
Yep.
think about where they're headed, and what skills are going to be required to
That's
get
right.
them there.
Yep.
And whether or not then in that workforce planning mode that isn't just about headcount and when do I hire people and for how much, but what types of people do I hire?
right.
What are the skills that we're going to need in the future? And really evaluating then their organization to say what skills do we currently have and how do we fill that gap? Is
Yeah.
it by training?
Right.
Is it by hiring, or is it by somehow outsourcing
Yeah.
folks? That world of workforce planning is really beginning, I think, to see
Absolutely.
a tremendous amount of evolution here.
Absolutely.
It's very exciting.
Well, it's interesting if you converge the topics we've been talking about, process, the people aspects, and trust. I had a client that had a really interesting intersection that a leader had gone after an automation strategy, and there was a lot of resistance, right? They wanted to understand sort of how is this going to change my ways of working. His team was wondering what's my role. And what they did was they created a whole new organizational chart that actually included the bots.
Right.
And the bots had their own internal profile, their own job description, and it created a new paradigm that said this is just part of our team and how we're working. And it imbued a sense of trust that wasn't there before and said, listen, your role is here and look at how different your job is versus it was. And whatever the bot's name was, I forget the
Right.
name. They're part of our team. And so it is that interesting intersection of that, do we have the right people? Do we upskill them? But also you have to think of the technology almost as part of that workforce
Right.
aspect now too.
Well, and interestingly, trying to make sure that your team understands that though parts of what they were doing may somehow get automated, that doesn't replace them. What that actually does is free them up to do the things that are a little bit more value added,
Yeah.
that might be a little bit more challenging for them and
Right.
more engaging. And
Yeah.
so instead of a threat, it's really an opportunity.
That's absolutely right.
And that's sometimes very hard for people to see, but I think it's part of the narrative that has to take place as you think about some of this transformation.
That's right. Yep.
All right, guys, let's dive into that third pillar here around analytics, because we talked about collaboration.
Yep.
We talked about how these systems are generating a ton of data.
Yep.
How are these trends sort of changing the way we do analytics in organizations? Because it's not just finance anymore. We're pushing this out, again, to marketing's doing analytics, product is doing analytics. Give us a sense.
Yeah, I
Yep.
think what I'll sort of talked a little bit about it already, which is really engaging managers around the organization, and so it's about making sure that people have the right information available to the right people at the right time to make sure that they're making truly data-driven decisions, and so gaining insights from that data. What has to happen in order to make that possible is this sort of single source of truth, right? There's
Right.
got to be confidence in the data first and foremost. When there's confidence in the data that's being provided, then it sort of frees everyone up to stop questioning the data and to actually think about the implications of what they're seeing. So getting that single source of truth becomes incredibly, I'll say, it's like almost foundational for then really empowering the team to make good decisions off of data. I think that from there, then there's like you've got to cut through the volumes of data, right? So we as a finance team have to help the organization say, look, there's a lot of information out there, but here's what's most important. Let's help you to identify, the 3, 5, maybe max 10 things that are most important to you. That we need to be monitoring on an ongoing basis.
I mean, this is a great point. I can't tell you how many meetings I've gone into where the first words back in the old days were, "Are these numbers right?"
Right.
I mean, we've moved beyond that now, right?
Yeah.
And that's just
Absolutely,
huge.
absolutely move beyond that. What's helping us as well, and I think can't be lost in all of this, is that UI, the way that people are interacting with data is also getting easier. It's getting more intuitive. It's becoming less technical. We're less dependent upon that data scientist, that power user IT person that's going to be able to help me get reports out.
Sure.
I'm actually able to run reports myself. I'm able to dive into the data and explore to understand why something's happening as a business user, without needing, sort of a fleet of power analytics folks
Right.
to make that happen. And
Yeah.
so, that better reporting tools, better visualization tools, all of which are very business user friendly, has really, I think, empowered
Yeah.
a whole new sense of data exploration.
Yeah, and I do think it's changing the role that finance plays within the stack, right? If you think of it at the
Yep.
bottom, to your point about is it right? It used to be we'd have our papers and you look at it, and now it's the proverbial data lake. But I've also heard clients talk about data ponds. Data swamp was the new one that I heard.
Yeah.
So if it's a swamp, is it really actually
Right.
clean? And the whole idea of finance, maybe not certifying, but imbuing trust into that data is sort of step one. I think to your point, I'll call it the democratization of tools is really changing who can produce insight and how they do it. The interesting thing at the top is really comes down to the executives, which says, is the CFO asking for all this, but then actually using it? And so one of the simplest things I've seen was a CFO that said, these are the only things I'm going to look at. All this other stuff I'm not. And just that communication that says, oh, that report, it's not that it's not important, it's not useful. Okay, I'm going to park that. I'm going to produce something behind this. Totally changes the discussion as well,
Right.
for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, so we touched on it, nibbled at some of the technology out there.
Yeah.
Let's talk through some of the biggest and newest technology trends that are hitting the finance office.
Sure. So I mentioned the word assembling, and I think that really is, and it requires a different skill set, that mindset, right? You have cloud ERP platforms that come out of the box with a lot of capabilities that in legacy environments required a lot of customization. So that's sort of step one. Step two is you have a lot of choice in the cloud platform separate from ERPs that have hundreds, if not thousands, of services to access. And I think to your point about user accessibility, those are becoming much easier to access and use and plug into those ERP platforms. I think the interesting tension is going to come. We talked in preparation for this around blockchain. Like, is there a shift from the ERP to blockchain? I think that is still something that's hanging out there that requires a lot of trust in the economy, not just in companies. So whether that becomes the stable I think is further out. But this idea of assembling a cloud ERP, a cloud platform, and then the desktop apps we've been talking about, all of those become that ecosystem. And I think the key thing the CFO and leaders can play is what is our assembly of that, and making the choice up front, because a lot of times there's time spent on the selection process, the weighing of requirements, where if you feel that you have the right tools, you can get a lot of gains quicker if you make some choices and put that trust back into your people to drive it. So that assembler mindset is one that the competencies around communication, collaboration, that whole data idea is really coming together in the finance function, because they're the only ones at the table that see all the ins and outs. Others live in their parts of the business, and they're the ones that see it, so they have an opportunity to step up into that, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I'll take it into some of the things we're seeing that are just beginning to really take shape.
Yep.
That are pretty exciting, I think, for the finance team. And again, back to the opportunities they create as opposed to being worried about what it takes away from you.
Right.
And that's really what some of the machine learning technologies that I think we're
Yep.
going to see really begin to come into play in the world of planning. And
Yep.
that's both to help, I guess, on a number of different fronts. One, first is probably just help you to make sure that you haven't done something wrong.
Right.
And so error detection or anomaly detection, right?
Yep.
Have we created a plan that that is out of line with trends that otherwise would have been expected?
Right.
And it's an anomaly. There may be good reason for it, but being able to automate a process of spotting some of these anomalies, I think is, again, empowering the team to say, okay, rather than trying to catch them manually,
Yep.
if I can automate that process, then I can go figure out why we've got that anomaly. Is it the right thing or is it wrong? So first is anomaly detection. I think what you'll see over time then is almost, not almost, you'll see better automation of forecasts themselves, right? Better use of technologies to say, these are the trends, this is where things are headed. And so here's a more automated view from past data of where we are headed that will allow you to say, look, trends would tell me I'm headed in this direction. My driver-based modeling with a lot of human input into it says I'm going to head slightly differently.
Right.
And so now as a team, why are those different? Again, what is it that's driving a different outlook than what trends would have otherwise normally predicted for you? So
Right.
the machine learning technologies, I think, coming to play in planning is going to be very exciting. It's early days still. We have some work to do there, but we're beginning to see the fruits of that.
And I would say I have clients that have categorically done what you just said, and I think it's this continuum of testing it, proving it, trusting it, and there are some that are at the point of trust where they let the machine learning actually drive the forecast now. That proof point of, okay, let's let everyone go do it themselves and test it against, and forecast accuracy, speed to execute, and tolerance within actuals. All of those are starting to prove out and saying, well, the machine actually detected things that we didn't, and that's okay. That gave us better information to then have the conversation with marketing, with supply chain, with operations to say, how do we adjust the business? It is interesting, though. I'm seeing also that companies, there's some, it's not deferred maintenance, but more so they have steps to take before that. And a lot of them are still trying to figure out, how do I just get my information in? And so that idea of using that to prove is actually a great way to test that machine learning logic out.
Right.
Because right now they don't even trust some of the inputs coming in from the bots they're using or different technologies. And it serves as almost a testing layer without having reams of people go through and do test plans and UAT, et cetera. You can have the machine essentially do it for you.
I think what it's highlighting for many companies is the challenge that they have with the data, that fundamentally
Absolutely.
the data is, it's either not very clean, it's inconsistent, or it's in very disparate, siloed spots.
Right.
And so a big part of the groundwork that's going to be done now, I think, over the next couple of years is getting a common data model across the organization. And I think for finance teams that can really understand how to look at multiple systems to help the organization create that common data model, there's a lot of power in that. There's a lot of value and benefit, because with that common data model across the organization, then now you can start to say, okay, well, where's that data coming from?
That's right.
How do we make sure it's clean? And you can really begin to then trust the data, at which point then all of these, whether it's just the traditional planning processes or some of the more machine learning based technologies, you begin to say, yeah, okay, I have confidence in that because I know that I've actually got the right data from the right systems, and it's been cleaned in a way that I'm comfortable with.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. All right, let's put a bow on this by talking about how the modernization of finance is actually really impacting the entire organization, not just the finance org. And we've touched on a few things here throughout the discussion, but Rob, why don't you start? And
yeah, I think again at a really high level, it's how do you make your business more agile? How are you making faster decisions around the organization, not just within finance, but in all of those managerial areas functionally across the organization, by providing them with the data that they need to not just make gut-based decisions, but actually make data-driven decisions. So agility becomes really the kind of the key output of this. So with that agility, I'm harnessing growth in my organization, and I'm probably creating a competitive edge against my competitors that are not as agile and that are not as data-driven in the decision making that they're going through.
Yeah, I'd just say it comes down to, you mentioned trust before, is that the internal organizations come to finance for trust, and I think that trust is being broadened significantly. So you mentioned the common data model. It's not just about the general ledger accounts, the transactions that are flowing from AR, AP. It's how do I know what's been provisioned and used for my software company? How do I know that that number of shipments is accurate? And moving down in the ecosystem from a data perspective, that entire view of trust is not just coming from internal, but also regulators. Regulators are saying, we want you to, as you talk about non-GAAP measures or other ways of talking to the market, we need to know that you have trust in those numbers as well. So I really think that data trust provider is where it's going to start. And then the question is just organizationally, how does finance move into processes or other areas beyond that? But really it just starts with common steps. We talked about a lot of complex topics here, but bottom line is take the first step, figure out what to automate, take a step with your people, and start on that journey. And like we talked about, it's not a big transformation. It's modernization steps over time.
Yeah, it's a journey.
Yeah,
it is a journey.
for sure.
Well, on that note, I want to thank our guests for joining us today. Thank you guys. This has been great. And want to thank everyone for joining. And be sure to tune in next month for our next version of hashtag wdaychats.